Welcome to the podcast, The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry, a consultant, a coach, and a serial entrepreneur. The mission here is to teach, inspire, and to motivate. Today's episode is particularly important in our conversation, change makers, building a nation, how the GI Bill empowered veterans, and we're going to talk about honor flights as well. Now, as I was preparing, like I always do for my episodes, I started doing some research on the GI Bill. And I've come to the conclusion that not many non veteran civilians really understand or can appreciate the GI Bill. Now, I could be wrong, but I'm going to be bold enough to say it. If you don't like it, make a comment. But I want to give you a little historical flavor as we get into this conversation with Dr. Randy Plunkett. The GI Bill, is formerly known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And it truly was a groundbreaking piece of legislation coming out of the United States Congress. And it was aimed at helping returning World War II veterans to reintegrate into civilian life. And it was signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 22nd. Just a little his history for you. And it came with a number of benefits. And I just wanted to take you through a couple of things that I think non-veterans, lay people will can appreciate. The motivation behind this, the GI Bill, was the U.S. government anticipated a flood of returning veterans coming home from World War II. And policymakers, yes, Congress, if you're listening, yes, policymakers were concerned about the potential widespread unemployment and social unrest that might happen with returning veterans and some of the despair that they were living under. They were faced with economic hardship. They had little support from the government, and so they really got out there, and the government did some things to help them. A couple of key things that I want to point out before I introduce Dr. Plunkett. Some key provisions of the GI Bill was educational training. Veterans were provided college tuition, vocational and technical school, and a lot of people heard about that. They also had low interest loans that they can get, and then they were also given some unemployment benefits. And now, a couple of things. What did this do? The immediate impact is 7.8 million veterans participated in the educational training program. The GI Bill is credited with creating the modern American middle class. Check that out. By 1947, 50% of the college students in the United States were veterans. And the GI Bill boosted home ownership. So it really did. And veterans accounted for about 40% of new home purchases at the time. Now, all wasn't peaches and cream because as I was out talking with veterans the last couple of days, some of them talked about the discrimination and equities. And back then, back in 1944, 1950, some of the GI Bills, particularly African Americans, while they had the GI Bill, uh, didn't really, there were some inequities because of the Jim Crow laws in the South, and they couldn't participate in some of the educational components because universities weren't allowing them in. And in my research, some of the HBCUs, historically black colleges, were underfunded at the time. So it was a little bit different talking to some older African American veterans. But we're going to get into that. But nonetheless, the GI Bill was revolutionary for what it did for the United States. To help us unpack this and to give a lot more flavor than I can in my last 2 minutes is Dr. Randy Plunkett. So let me introduce you to my guest. Here we have Dr. Randy Plunkett. He is the founder and principal of Milvets Advantage, a consulting firm where he leverages his extensive background in veteran affairs and higher education. He has served in various leadership roles, including the advisor to both the Illinois governor and the Canadian ministers of on veteran transition. Dr. Plunkett is a retired senior master sergeant from the U.S. Air Force and holds a doctorate in educational leadership and innovation. Dr. Plunkett, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Dr. Terry. It's so great to meet you, Keith, and I'm excited to talk about the Servicemen's Readjustment Act today and
Oh,
how it
oh,
impacted our country.
Well, good. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you come from? Because you just didn't pop up.
Sure. So I'm a pretty much rural farm kid from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Um, and there were 8 communities in my high school. So any big town to me could be LA or New York or Chicago. It just doesn't matter because I came from a town of about 200 people. And I would say we were lower middle class most of my life, and
Okay.
then moved when I was 16 to Maryland. And my father became an executive in a food corporation and was kind of like moving to a whole new world for us.
Okay.
So went in the Air Force 10 days out of high school. Barely made it out of
Wow.
high school. I was not a
Okay.
good student at all. I was, and when people said they were in the lower third of their class, I think I might have been number three from the bottom of my class.
Okay.
But to make a long story short, I went to Japan probably 7 months after I enlisted, and there I ran smack dab into education.
Okay.
Um, because of my work schedule, I only worked 3, 4 days a week in the Air Force. It was a pretty easy life, and I had a supervisor who was a very, very quickly promoted, very intelligent guy, and he said you should go to school. And
Okay.
so in Okinawa, I experienced going to the University of Maryland, Los Angeles Community College. My mother was very excited when I called her and said, "Hey, I'm going to the University of Maryland." She said, "Oh, you're getting out and coming home?" I said, "No, I'm going here." So Maryland has been involved in worldwide education since about 1947,
Okay.
mostly on military bases, but now, of course, the University of Maryland University College has had locations overseas all that time, and of course, mainly they're online now. But that really impacted me because I thought I was dumb. I didn't think I could learn, and I realized that learning something I'm interested in on my terms, especially because I had skin in the game because the Air Force tuition assistance only paid 75%. You had to pay 25% out of your pocket.
Okay. Okay.
So,
Had to have a little skin in the game.
absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. Today, that's not the case. They cover
Right.
100% up to about $4,500 a year. But it gave me a what I call an awakening of a penchant for learning.
Okay, well,
That
good. But well, let me ask this. Staying back from a historical standpoint, you're the 16-year-old kid. I guess 18 maybe when you went away. What was the if you can remember, I'm sure you can. What was your mindset when you decided I'm going to go to the military?
I knew I wasn't college material at all.
Okay. Well,
My
you've proven
father,
that wrong.
oh yeah, at least from the traditional thinking.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
just a sidebar, I learned about Garner's learning styles, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and realized I'm a musical learner. If I was able to put my homework to music, then I probably could have retained it better and been a better student.
Yes.
My father had served in the Korean War. However, he was in the Air Force and he was in Hawaii for 3 years. So
Oh, okay.
he really
Okay.
didn't see a whole lot of combat except for combating surf when he was trying to use a surfboard. Um, but the impact and what I learned later and why I got an interest in the GI Bill itself was my
Okay.
father earned his GED while he was in the Air Force.
Excellent.
And just to give a plug to your alma mater, University of Chicago was hugely influential in developing the GED in the early part of the century for an alternative high school credential, along with the University of Iowa. So that really formulated itself as part of the training in World War II for GIs. That's where the
Okay.
GED was implemented for those who quit school. Or remember in 1939, 1940, the mark of an educated person in our country was an eighth grade education.
That's
People
right.
had the
Yeah.
traditional
Yeah.
one room schoolhouse
Yeah.
education. And if they finished, but most boys did not, they went off to work or they went to the fields or they went to the factory or they worked in maybe their dad's business or something. Most of them did not. So that's the crop we have to deal with when Pearl Harbor is invaded for both draft
Mm.
and for enlistment is people who've left education long behind and wanted nothing to do with it. So knowing my dad was in the Air Force and knowing that the GED, he was very proud of the fact that he earned that. Um, that really made me focus on the military as an option versus going to college because I
Gotcha.
knew
Gotcha.
I joke about this because my friend and I talk about it, that his first year in college, he said, I'm convinced that my blood alcohol content was higher than my grade point average.
Gotcha. Now,
So,
as back then when you were a serviceman, did you appreciate the GI Bill as much as you did post? Or, well, you tell me, at what point
well,
did you start to really appreciate its impact?
I think most people who either early on in their military thinking about life after the military or the motivation to join, it still shows up as patriotism and education are probably in the top three reasons
Hmm.
that people join. The other one being getting a vocation, perhaps. But I had appreciation for it, and but I didn't realize the impact it was going to have. To me, that penchant for learning is what clicked it on for me, realizing, hey, I've got this in addition to the tuition benefits you get while you're in the military. I've got this GI Bill for when I get out, and that's kind of going to be my motivation for education.
Now, speaking of that, did I, in my introduction, get the GI Bill description right?
You absolutely did, yes.
Okay.
And I'll start when we're ready for that question about how did it come to pass.
Well, let's talk about that now. How did it
Let's
come to
do it.
pass?
People don't understand that in World War One, which we were only in very briefly, the United States was only in it for 2 years.
Okay.
But those who did not serve fared better economically than those who served. So doughboys came home and realized their friends made a ton more money during the war because of many war efforts and other things. And a lot of them were very frustrated and felt like, hey, I served our country. I should get some kind of reward for that to kind of equalize me with those in my strata. Remember, disgruntled veterans from World War One in Germany and Italy started the Nazi and fascist parties.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They did
Okay.
because they were ready to overthrow their government because they were so disillusioned and so poor. And again, most Americans in 1918, college was for the elite.
Yeah.
College was for folks that, I mean, no, only those who either came over on the Mayflower or those who had the opportunity afforded to them through other economic or influential factors went to college. So most of these people were not even high school educated. They were very poor. So in 1924, there was a law passed called the Bonus Act, which basically told
Ah.
military members, we're going to give you some money and we'll give you this voucher, but it's not going to mature for 20 years. So the gesture was great, but really the result was very, very few people got any kind of money. That meant in 1932, there was a big revolt. Veterans from all across America came to Washington, D.C., and you can look at this. It's called the Bonus March of 1932. And in that mall area were
Yeah.
all these shacks and tenements and tents. And they said, we're not leaving till you pay us. We're not leaving. And it resulted in American soldiers attacking veterans. And the leaders were MacArthur and Patton.
Wow. They
MacArthur,
this wow. So I understand. In my research, I found the march, but I didn't know that the military went after the veterans.
Herbert Hoover, the president, ordered MacArthur to send troops down there and, his words, clear out that rabble. And the thing is, there were all kinds of nationalities,
Yeah.
because there were several doughboys that were African American, Hispanic, Native American. They like the military were like, we're all coming to town because we all get this. So that was a horrible, horrible experience for our country. And many believe that Hoover lost the election in 32 to Roosevelt because of the bonus march. So a lot of them went home just dejected. And the key here is Franklin Roosevelt was the assistant secretary of the Navy in 1919
Hmm.
during right after World War One. He saw all this happening with that disillusioned group of veterans. His mind after during World War II was, I do not want 17 million people coming home to no job, no
Yes.
opportunities.
Yes.
And we need to do something to take care of these people. And part of that was altruistic, part of it was self preservation.
Right. Right.
They're
Right.
going to come out here, and now there's a ton more than there were in World War One, and they're going to overthrow us like the Nazis and the fascists did. So that was a big motivator for him to continually bother Congress leading up to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It was written by the American Legion.
Oh.
And if you go to the American Legion website, there's a movie here, Keith, that I really think is missing. There was a big fight in Congress when it was in committee, and William Rankin was a senator, a congressman, excuse me, from Mississippi, a rock rib racist.
Okay.
And he did not want this bill to pass because Roosevelt insisted this is colorblind. If you served, you get it.
Okay.
And that's only the second piece of legislation in our history that was written that way. This is for all people, men and women,
Wow.
and all cultures and races and backgrounds. You serve, you get it. So there were several components, and it was written by James Comery, who was the president of the American or the commander of the American Legion in early '44, and that was what was taken to
You know,
Congress.
not many, like I said, not many civilians know this story. I mean,
No, they don't. And here's the key, real quick, and you can go to the American Legion website and read this story. There was a congressman in Georgia who was home, and he gave his proxy vote to Rankin and said, "I'm voting against it." Rankin had his proxy vote and was going to change it, and I mean, he said, "I'm voting for it," and Rankin changed it and said, "I'm going to vote against it." Well, Roosevelt had such great favor with the media and with the Legion and with the VFW, who were
yeah.
politicking. They found out about this the day before, that
Wow.
tomorrow it's going to die in committee because Rankin's going to shut it down. So they went looking for this guy, and I can't remember his name. It's John something. He was hunting out in the middle of nowhere. But
Okay.
there was such a connection with the media, Roosevelt, William Randolph Hearst, who had been his papers had all been generating positivity, that they put out radio broadcasts. Where is this congressman? We need him to come home. The state police were out looking for him. He came
Wow.
home that evening, and they drove him to Jacksonville, Florida, and flew him overnight to D.C. so he could vote in person and vote for it. And it passed by only 2 or 3 votes out of committee.
Well, thank God it passed.
Oh my
You know.
goodness. So it was signed into law in '44. The next day, the very first guy to use the GI Bill was in DC at Georgetown, or GW, might have been GW, and said,
Okay.
"Hey, I just heard about this." And yeah, there's a great story on that too. So it snowballed, and the word got out, and they produced materials for people that are currently serving. Hey, this is waiting for you when you get back. And so that's really how it all came to pass. Unfortunately, it didn't get a lot of attention because June of '44, when it was signed, was D-Day. So
Okay.
that really kind of pushed it to the back pages for most of the public to understand it.
And
However,
and and I wonder if they were communicating this great benefit to the veterans.
well, the key here is yes, they were, because all of the veterans organizations were filled with, if you served in 41, 42, and 43 and you were out for some reason, you were a member of the VFW or the
I see. I
American
see.
Legion or Jewish war veterans or
Right.
Tuskegee Airmen. There's all kinds of
Right.
groups that existed. So they were getting the word out to their members. But remember, most of the people were still in '44 because the war didn't end until '45. So they were briefed about it. I thought, oh, I was going to grab it. I actually
Well,
have a,
you know what's interesting about this is, I know we're back, we're still talking history here, but it really had a pretty revolutionary impact on the U.S. economy.
well, it really did. And I talk about this a lot that in 1939, only 1/3 of Americans owned homes. 2/3 of our country were renters at all economic levels were renters. By 1949, 2/3 of Americans were homeowners and one-third were
Wow.
renters
Wow.
because of the GI Bill. That's probably the benefit that was taken advantage of second behind the education piece.
Education. Okay.
Right. And then you mentioned the unemployment benefits. It was called the 5250 Club.
The 5250.
You got
Okay.
$50 a week for 52 weeks, and that was the least used benefit.
Really? Okay.
People were too proud.
Or did they have jobs?
No, they were too proud, even if they didn't. They thought,
I see.
and it didn't matter race, gender, class, didn't matter. There was this sense of self worth, and you got to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Something I think is missing in our society
Yeah.
today. When
Yeah.
I always think about, you know, people that are out protesting against the economy and capital, and like, do you have a job? If you don't, I can get you three of them tonight. You might
Right.
not be what you want to do, but we all do what we got to do to get where we're going. So, at any rate, you did mention that the benefits. There was some unemployment benefits, training benefits. You want to start a business? There was loans for that as well.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't know that because
yeah,
I was going to ask you now. You know, many view the GI Bill through the lens of educational
right.
benefits, but what are some of the less talked about benefits
So
that might have shaped the veterans' lives and the U.S. economy?
here's the key about education. That included training. By the time we get to 55, half the people have used some kind of a training or vocational or educational benefit. 8
Hmm.
million out of the 17 million almost.
Mhm.
However, that means they touched it. Doesn't mean they got any kind of credential. And of the 7 million that used the education benefit, 7, 8 million, less than half were college. The vast majority were people using it for vocational training
Okay.
or for learning how to do very practical. There were 5 umpire schools in America that were getting GI Bill benefits. So you think about that. I love the story of the new School of Social Research Dramatic Workshop Institute, now part of Pace University in New York City. And we've all seen um, the broadcast of James Lipton, where he interviews actors. That's
Yeah.
the new School of Social Research.
Okay.
At In 1946, there were two guys standing in line, Walt and Tony, complete different backgrounds. They're in line because they want to go to the Dramatic Workshop Institute, and they had to audition. So they're standing in line yakking. And Tony says, "Well, I'm going to be an actor. I'm going to be world famous, and I'm going to be a movie star." And and Walt said, "Well, I want to be an actor too." And so they all like were lined up waiting forever, and they got up there and they said, "Here's your scripts. Come back tomorrow. You got to audition." Well, this Tony guy was this gregarious, over the top personality. He said, "I worked all night on this thing." And he said, "I got up and I said about 3 words." And they said, "Great, awesome, good job, you're in." And he said, "I left. And then I came back for school. And in my class is this Walt guy." And he says, "Man, you must have nailed your audition too." He said, "Tony," he said, "they just get the money from the government." He said, "Look at me. Do I look like a movie star?" It was Tony Randall and Walter Matthau,
Oh, wow. I know
you
those
know,
names.
and
Yeah.
there were all. B. Arthur was in their class. She was a woman Marine
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
used the GI Bill to go to school, as well as Harry Belafonte. They were all classmates there. That story went everywhere. Yes, it did informal education.
Hmm.
Even down the road from me here at the University of Wisconsin, Camp Randall Stadium was Vetville. It was filled with all these trailers and buildings of married students who had families, who had jobs, who were at
Right.
Yale. These guys, you were talking about 50% of the students in 47 were
Yep.
GIs. At Yale, they were called DARs,
DARS. Why DARS?
damned average raisers. These guys are
Okay.
taking 18 and 20 credits. Nobody ever heard of that before. And working a job and getting amazing grades, but they felt like, I came out of war. I don't have much time.
Gotcha.
So a lot of traditions were changed in higher education. Rushing for fraternities and sororities. Pfft, Some guy said at Cornell, this guy came rushing up and said, "Hey, freshman, you got to wear this beanie." He said, "I was at Guadalcanal. I'm not wearing your damn beanie."
Beanie. I hear
So it
you.
changed everything.
Right.
Night classes, summer schools, community colleges mainly blossom. I mean,
Yeah.
except for down the road from you, Joliet Junior College, which is never going to change its name because it was one of the first community colleges in the country.
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
were no historic community colleges. And all these alternatives came because there was this big revelation that came out of the GI Bill that, hey, adults want to learn and want education too. College is not just for the
And
elite.
has the GI Bill, as we move it up to the 80s and 90s, has it stayed the same? Are the benefits changing? Can you
Oh, the
elaborate on
benefits
that a
have
little bit?
changed over the years. Yes. So a couple of good things. If you've served since 2013, you have a lifelong GI Bill. It used to be a 10-year window you had to use it.
Why 10 windows?
Well, there was a 10-year window. If you were served up until probably the 90s, you got
Okay.
10 years after you get out to use your GI Bill or it expires. Now,
Wow.
because of the implementation of certifications, especially in the IT world, the expansion of what you can use your GI Bill with continued with opportunities. So people would use GI Bill to get Microsoft certs or cloud certification from Google or what have you. But there was just a window. If you didn't use it, and it was a government way to save money.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that it's a
Yeah,
lifelong bill now. I
now it's
mean,
lifelong. But really, even today, only about 50% of people who are eligible for the GI Bill use it.
and it still includes educational benefits.
It
Home
does.
are there home loan
Yeah,
implications?
GI Bill, you could still get a VA loan. You've probably heard
Oh,
that
that's right.
term,
Yep,
VA
I
loan.
had VA loan.
And you can even, there are instances where people can assume a VA loan who are not veterans,
Okay,
buying a home from someone who's a vet.
okay.
But in the middle, between the 50s and 60s, so the Vietnam era GI Bill ended in 75. That was probably the last time there was really a very healthy benefit. That's the one I had when I got out of the Air Force and went to college
Now,
in a
what do you mean
traditional sense.
healthy benefit? What
Well,
elaborate
healthy
on
in
that?
that I got married, I got more money. I had a child, I got more money.
I see. Okay,
Well, that stopped in probably the Montgomery GI Bill of 1984. That's the one where people had to pay in,
I see.
and the resulting benefit was not as um, lucrative. It didn't cover all of your education. Remember, in 1945, in 44, when the GI Bill passed, the most expensive school in America was Harvard University. You want to guess what it cost to go to Harvard a year in 1945?
Oh wow. Boy, that's a hard one. $1,000?
$500,
Five. Wow, that's a lot of money back then.
which back then was like 50,000 to most people. You're making a couple cents a week, 50
Yeah,
bucks a week. Are you
yeah.
kidding me? That's what a lot of these guys said. My goodness, that's a lot of money. $50 a week, man. I can buy a house. I can have two cars. Like that was huge money, and that's why I think people kind of it was very lucrative. But I think people who got on it kind of felt guilty
Well, you know
because
what's interesting? As I was doing my due diligence for this episode, I this is why I am convinced that lay people don't really understand this. I know it happened based on my research in 1944. I just thought it was a benefit that people got being in the military. I didn't think you had to pay into it. The pay into it part you just
yeah,
told me happened in 1985,
84.
84. Is it still that way now or
No,
is it
no,
okay?
because when 9/11 happened, they came up with a new GI Bill that was very similar to the Service Members Readjustment Act of 44.
Okay.
Much more lucrative. You didn't pay into it anymore. And it covered everything. When it first started, it covered just about any educational pursuit you wanted, including there was an aviation bachelor's degree that was like 17 grand a year, and it covered that. Now, if you're
Well,
going to go to an Ivy, here's what happens there. Let's say I was privileged enough to get into Dartmouth. Okay. The max GI Bill is not going to cover that. But colleges and universities have an option. Your alma mater, University of Chicago. If I'm using the GI Bill, it's probably not covering everything. But UC says, look, we'll do a split with the government. Here's how that works. Let's say it costs you $50,000 a year to go to University of Chicago. The GI Bill pays 30,000. Okay,
Gotcha.
you got 20,000 left. This is what University of Chicago elects to do. We will eat $10,000, and the Fed say, great, we'll give you an additional 10,000.
There you
So
go.
if you're privileged enough and have the brains enough to get into an Ivy League school, you can still use a GI Bill if they choose to do this kind of
Yeah, I got you.
split program. Some
Now,
don't.
I have one more question before we start talking about honor flights,
Okay.
and that's the impact. That's the challenge part of the GI Bill, and I'd be remiss if I didn't really talk about that a little bit. Um, for some folks who came back from war, African Americans specifically, they face challenges. Did that challenge or the difficulties, and has it persisted through
I will put it this way.
1984?
No, I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Even though the GI Bill was colorblind, the decisions were made locally on awarding the GI Bill by committees. In the South, Alabama, Mississippi, even up to Arkansas, Missouri, there were a lot of very prejudicial boards. This
Yes,
especially was true in Mississippi.
yes,
And that results in a vast, again, nation building, a vast migration of African Americans to the North, to
gotcha.
Chicago, to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Pittsburgh, because there they could use their GI Bill without this. And so there's a cover of a Life magazine. I tried to find it, I think 1947, at Wayne State University, where there's an African American gentleman sitting at a table with white girls and two white guys. He was a student at Wayne State from Mississippi, and he said, I tried and tried to get in school. They wouldn't let me do it. I moved here, and he became an engineer in
Gotcha.
Detroit.
Gotcha.
And so that really was that influence on us culturally, in that, yes, you're a person who served, you get it regardless of your genetics or your your chromosomes. However, there's still this barrier that
Hmm.
happened, but not in the North, mainly still left over in the South. So that
Yeah.
resulted in a
And I
large.
would assume
Yeah.
some of those change. Has it changed or is it still the same?
No, I think it's changed. That's now all approved by the VA. There's no local oversight
Okay,
except
good,
for the VA regional offices, and of course,
good.
it's anti-discrimination laws prevent that.
And I'm also curious when the GI Bills change, is it retroactive or just for those folks that serve from that point forward?
It's from that point forward. Here's a good example. I served in 75 to 79 the first time. I was still covered under the Vietnam era GI Bill. So that stayed.
That's pretty good, I
It was
guess.
good for me because I made money. I got a cost of living allowance, and I got married while I was in school, got more money, had a child, got more money. So, but that changed with really the all volunteer force started in 1973, and we haven't had the draft, thank God, since then, even though we all had to register.
Well,
But
you
that
know, sorry,
that
I'm
was
sorry
the
for
change
cutting you off.
there.
Well, based on what I'm hearing from you and my research, this would be a very different country had it not been for the GI
There is
Bill.
no doubt because that grew our middle class, and there were so many people that would have had no aspirations for college or training. I mean, there's a great movie from about 19, I think either 84 or 94. It was the 50th anniversary. And
Mhm.
there's a guy talking about, I went to undertaking school. He said, if I didn't have that, I probably would have got a job as a garbage man in New York because that's what my family did. And he
Right.
said, then I had my own business. And another guy said, I went to pharmacy school. And a lot of the engineers, um, if you've ever seen the movie, what's it called? Invisible Voices, about the African American computers
Yeah.
during NASA. A lot of those engineers were World War II vets who were farm kids.
Hidden
Or
Figures, I think you were talking about. Yeah.
Hidden Figures, yes. A lot
Yeah.
of those engineers were not, they weren't science kids. They were eighth grade in
Right.
some cases dropout, but the GI Bill changed their whole trajectory in life.
So we're going to switch topics now, and we're going to talk about honor flights. And I'm actually a little excited to talk about this one because up until having an initial conversation with you, I've never heard of honor
Yeah.
flights. So just tell us what honor flights is.
So, like you, we moved to Wisconsin in 2023, and I'd never heard of them either. And I've been in the military business for most of my life. An honor flight is a group of local people who rally with veteran groups to find veterans to fly to DC for a day to tour historical monuments and places and national, like the Capitol and the Vietnam Wall and all these kinds of things, just to honor those veterans. And it's really, it's like a Super Bowl.
Oh wow, is it?
I think I is my I'm so feel so strongly about this that when every kid turns 18 and they can vote, they should be required to go to an honor flight celebration. So I'll tell you what happens locally. And the reason I found out is because I'm a singer. I'm a vocalist.
Okay.
I'm a
Okay.
hip 50s, 60s singer. And someone asked me to sing the national anthem at the honor flight. I
Okay.
said, okay, tell me about it. Well, you got to be there 5 in the morning. What?
I've
Got to be there 5 in the morning. And we have a celebration and talk about and honor the veterans. Most of them now are Vietnam vets. This started with World War II and Korean vets, and now has moved to Vietnam vets, who are many of them are in their 80s,
Yep.
and then younger vets too. Now we've got some Desert Storm and Desert Shield vets going on it, but basically, it's a time to say thank you, a time to honor them. And Keith, it's like a big pep rally. This is at the
Gotcha.
Madison Airport, and
Wow.
everything gets disrupted. People get rerouted to go through TSA over there, and you can't go up these stairs. And it's packed with people, and they're all there to celebrate these folks getting on an airplane. Some of them are escorts. The veteran always brings an escort, so usually it's a child or a relative or spouse. They feed them breakfast, fly them to DC. They have this little celebration, and usually a guest speaker, like maybe the general from the National Guard would be a speaker or something.
Right.
They fly to DC that day. Everything is regulated for them. They get to go to all of these places, and
And
then
what
they
a wonderful way to honor
yeah,
veterans who I bet probably feel a little bit underappreciated.
especially the Vietnam veterans.
Yeah,
They
because
were treated so
I
poorly.
bet in my due diligence, and you think about it, World War One, World War Two, the Korean War, Vietnam, Desert Storm. You know, I'm I think about the various veterans who served in World War One. I saw the movie 1917. You think about um, war was different. Fighting was different back then than it is now. And,
Absolutely.
and 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 I say this very humbly because as a civilian, I don't. I haven't been to boot camp. I just know they teach you guys a lot, but when you have to shoot someone or bombs and mortars and you're close to it, it's a very different humbling experience, and you come back
Well,
and you face folks who want to get in your face politically, and you're just trying to serve your country, or you go over there and you're an African American or you're anyone, and you come back, you don't feel appreciated. I bet these honor flight celebrations are probably pretty emotionally moving for some
big
of the
time.
veterans.
Big time. Especially those, like you said, one of two things happened. They saw things they never talked about again, ever.
Oh wow.
Or when they returned, they faced that kind of. I'll never forget a guy who was in my dissertation committee, had a master's in history from Chapel Hill, and then he got his doctorate from Columbia. But he said, when I came back from Vietnam, because of my master's degree, I went to teach ROTC at Stanford. And he said, the day before I got there, they burned down the building. He said, we
Wow.
never wore a uniform. He said there were huge flags of Mao and of Stalin hanging on the campus. And he said, I was scared for my life. He said, I was more afraid there than I ever was in Vietnam. I slept with a bayonet under my pillow because there were such radical, people. And I get people getting frustrated and resulting in,
Hmm.
acts
Hmm.
of violence. But he said there were people out to kill people. And he said, I couldn't wait to get out of there. So think about that. Here's an artillery guy who saw all kinds of things in Vietnam. Then he comes back, and this is what I get when I come home to my country. This is what I was fighting for. And again, being spit on or ridiculed or riding a bus. I know there's a guy in Mississippi who was white. He had his uniform. He said they made me sit in the back of the bus. He said I felt like Rosa Parks. They treated me like crap when I was trying to go home. And he
Wow.
said it all plays in your mind. Like, my best friend was black, and I saw his leg blow off, and he said now I come home to this, and he
Yeah.
said it's not race, it's the uniform that's a stigma. And so you're right. People never talked about that again. Now they're going on these flights, and it's
And so
just
does the government uh, reimburse or pay for
all
any of this?
nonprofit, my friend.
All
All
nonprofit.
nonprofit, all done through contributions, donations. We talk about some of the aspects of our country that are negative. We are still the country that has more charitable giving than any other country.
Yes, we do.
And when it comes to veterans, and I used to work for Wounded Warrior Project, and they said, you here in the nonprofit space, you want to get money, children, animals, veterans.
I didn't.
That's what pulls the heartstrings, no matter what your politics are,
Right.
because that's our country's fabric. Is that I feel like you could be hate this person, hate that person, this group, that group, but when it comes to North Carolina, what everything those folks went through with the floods, I want to get in my car and drive down there and just say, what
Mhm.
can I do? And I think most people feel that way, you know.
So as we look to the future, because we're getting ready to close out here.
Yeah.
Anything? What's your view of the future of the GI Bill or honor flights or any way of honoring veterans?
Um, Two things I'm very concerned about. One, I don't know that we've got the current manpower if we ever have to face more than one conflict. If we get into a war,
Oh,
I think the draft is going to come into play. That's my opinion. We're in the same boat we were in World War II. The Army and Navy were very small in 1940, very small, and we needed
mm,
people in a hurry. So I'm concerned about that, and I pray that we never get there. I think it's always going to be a situation where those who choose to serve um, will have that as a motivation, even if they don't going in like I did. I, I thought maybe school later, but I'm just here to. But when you're confronted with that, and it does change people, and I think the average college freshman changes their major like they change their socks. And to
yes.
me, the impact of this is my opinion. Every kid coming out of high school should have to serve doing something, not necessarily military. Go work for Greenpeace. Go work for a nonprofit advocacy group. Go work with AIDS patients in Africa or somewhere. When you come back at 20 years old, your whole perspective is going to be different. And
Yeah. I yes.
that's why those folks coming back now are like, I don't want to go to a dance and I don't want to join a fraternity. I got school to do. I got business to take care
You know,
of.
I used to be staunchly opposed to that view, and of course I was young. Um, but I have fortunately in my lifetime, and I say fortunately, been to every continent. I've traveled a lot, and I can tell you that having gone over to Israel as one country, the men serve 2 years, the women serve one. Maybe it's changed everyone. And the older you get, and when you see different things, it just gives you a different level of
Yep.
appreciation. And I do think there would be a huge um, benefit to the young folks who would serve in that kind of capacity. I'm not so sure it's going to happen. It's going to take something pretty traumatic in the world to get the public or
Yep.
Congress to mandate such a thing. But I do, now that I'm a dad, I can just tell you that when you're a teenager, you think like a teenager, but when you start visiting and seeing what you have, the freedoms in this country, and we have our problems, but they're very different than some of the other countries. You know,
I think
um,
there's three kinds of people in the world, and you could look at generations. There's
yeah,
those who watch things happen. That's our senior folks, our experienced folks who look for wisdom and give advice. Those who make things happen, that's that middle area where folks are, in work and doing things and making a difference. And then there's those who say, "What happened?" That's our young generation.
right.
And we don't want to be in that last group. So be a part of making things happen, and then have that legacy built and look back on it. So that's what you're doing, and I appreciate that about you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for being a guest on the show, Dr. Plunkett. I really appreciate it. It was delightful talking with you, and the things you had to say about the GI Bill and the honor flights. I really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to The Next Big Thing. I'm your host, Keith D. Terry. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support this podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media or leave a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on my YouTube channel at Keith D. Terry. If you want to recommend a guest, please email me at info@terryperformancegroup.com. This has been produced by your host and Jade Productions.